Going. All right. So our goal for today is to continue working on the Taylor, which in fairness will be our goal for the next little bit, actually. So I probably don't need to keep saying that. What we're going to talk about today is what's called the Enchanted Universe and a corresponding sense of what it is that a person is, what kind of thing that we are. So that's going to be our main target today. We'll talk a little bit about some of the social and political stuff that Taylor was talking about today too. That won't be our immediate target, at least, but we will get there sort of along the way. What we're going to talk about today is really weird and really hard for all of us to get back to. So I always joke, because I see one of the classes I teach here is medieval philosophy at CSU, and I always joke at the beginning of that class that so if you're a Game of Thrones fan, Game of Thrones is way closer to us than it is in the Middle Ages. Like the Middle Ages is so weird, and how people thought was so different than anything we can wrap our minds around, really, that it's actually quite difficult to go back to it. It's quite difficult to get a sort of sense of how people were seeing the world then. And that's one of the things that Taylor really wants to do today. Like, remember, his sort of overarching claim is that what secularism is it's the conceivability of not believing in God, basically, right? That's how he's sort of, in a sense, defined it. In particular, that sort of human happiness, like in the fullest sense of whatever that means, can be attained without God. And his claim is that this is new, that until the 19th century, or really maybe even slightly before that, but not much before that, like this was an unthinkable thing. That there really, outside of maybe random individuals here or there were no real atheists. There was not this exclusive humanism as an option that anyone could have conceived of as a legitimate option. And again, he fully grants there are always occasional historical outliers, right? But we're talking about the mass of people, not even just the mass of like the general people, but even the mass of elites. The mass of the sort of the most educated of people wouldn't have understood how modern life was organized to sort of see why we kind of have to almost go back and put ourselves into what was going on in the late Middle Ages. So that's what we're going to try to start doing today. There's a couple steps to it, basically, that we're going to need. But we're going to begin trying to put ourselves back into this old way of conceptualizing the world. Curiously, if you want to actually find things that sort of show this the best, we actually have to go to horror movies. Horror movies are the few things that actually feature some of the mindset. They sort of are imitating some features of the mindset. As Taylor points out, it's because the mindset is so foreign to us, we can sort of like go back to it as a lark, maybe. Whereas the things that we have in our horror movies were very real fears, like demonic possession of people in the late Middle Ages. There's a movie in particular, if you want to do something weird this weekend, there's a movie called The Curse of the Werewolf. It's a Hammer horror movie from the late 1950s, early 1960s. And it actually is the closest I've seen. It's British, which I think has something to do with it, where there's still a little bit more of this enchanted-y sense. But it's the closest thing I've seen to a movie just really straightforwardly working from and assuming this idea of the enchanted universe that's going to be our main target. And the sense of like terror that there would actually be in such an enchanted universe. So that we're going to try to work this out. But if you want to do something fun over the weekend, see if you can find that movie somewhere. I imagine there are ways of finding it extra legally if you so chose to. It could be a fun thing to check out, just to sort of see in action what it would be like to conceptualize the world in this way. All right. So that's my little preamble. Anyone have any questions, thoughts, comments about anything before we dive into it?
Oh, what'd you say the name of the movie was?
Oh, yeah, sorry. I'll write it up on the whiteboard.
Thank you.
Yeah, Curse of the Werewolf. Yeah, it's a Hammer. It's one of the old Hammer horror movies. I think it's like 1958, something like that. It could be a few years earlier or later, but something like that. And it sort of does it a little bit, does the thing, at least more than anything else that I've ever seen. It kind of does the thing. Good. Any other thoughts or questions about anything? All right, then let's jump in to things getting weird. So The question that Taylor sort of frames today's reading with is the question that's really going to be the central one of most of the book that we're going to read. So the question is sort of a two-part question. One, why was it virtually impossible to not believe in God in 1500? And then second, and sort of like related, just the other side of the same question, what changes such that it is impossible? Sorry, not believe in, not, I assume people believe in 1500, make that better. Not believe in God in the year 1500. And what changes such that it is possible to believe it, to not believe in God in 2000? What changes over this 500-year stretch? And fundamentally, I can give you the rough set of his answer right now. Fundamentally, the answer to both questions is the way in which we conceive ourselves. What we take ourselves to be as human beings changes. And based on what we conceived ourselves to be in 1500, it almost didn't make sense without a postulation of God. Whereas how we see ourselves today makes it possible to deny the existence of God, though Taylor insists by no means necessary. You don't have to in 2000s, but the way that we think of ourselves now opens up that door. It makes it conceivable, a live possibility. Remember what our sort of target is with sort of what he was calling last class secularism 3, right? Right. This is it's possible that I could or could not believe in God. That's the thing that we sort of want to explain. And so then how are we sensing ourselves such that this possibility emerges? What are other ways of sensing ourselves such that that possibility wouldn't emerge? That's Taylor's sort of central project for the part of the book that we're going to read at least. All right. So everyone good so far? Everyone good so far? That all makes sense? All right. So also, by the way, that also could have easily been the daily assignment for the day. It could have basically been that, right? What Taylor's thesis in the reading is. So I saw a bunch of those had come in. I'll try to look at them probably tomorrow so I can get your feedback really fast if you need to tweak anything on them. But it looked like everyone was getting those turned in well successfully. So I'll try to get your feedback on those daily assignments pretty quick just to make sure all on the same page with it. Basically, every day there is a reading, there'll be a daily assignment due. That's the general rule of thumb. A few exceptions, but that'll be the basic rule of thumb. All right. So Taylor gives at the very beginning of the first chapter, Taylor gives us sort of like 3 things that change. And so we're going to talk about, I'm going to invert his order because for some weird reason he introduces these in the opposite order that he ends up talking about them in the book. So I'm actually going to go in the order they occur in the book. So the first thing in 1500, so the first feature that no longer exists, so start first, just do the negative project. The universe was conceived of in a quote unquote enchanted way, and we'll spend most of today just defining what that means. And both of these are not just features of sort of like intellectual theories, though they are that too. They're features of the popular understanding, how people just in general vaguely conceptualize the world. And Taylor's getting this word enchanted from a bunch of talk in sociology and the history of ideas, where it said that we today live in a disenchanted universe. So he wants to retroactively say, okay, but what was the enchanted one then? What was that? What has been disenchanted? What does that mean? This is going to be our main target today, is going to be to talk about this one. Second feature of 1500 that no longer exists, it is impossible to conceive or understand the sort of civic, political, social structure without God. And we'll talk about this a little bit today. We'll talk about it more as we go. But this we'll hit a little bit of this one. There's going to be a close connection. The way in which reality is enchanted is going to suggest certain kinds of civic or political structures around it. And then the third of these, which is what we'll talk about next week on Tuesday, there is a conception of what we could call the universe, or better, the cosmos. And one of the things we'll do next week, we'll talk about how these two words are different. We talk about universes, they would have talked about a cosmos, and there is perhaps an important distinction between the two. But for now, we won't worry about that. Nature and time. And this specific conception is overturned and, broadly speaking, replaced. We'll say a lot more about this later, but this is, broadly speaking, replaced by a sort of Newtonian conception. Loosely, and Newtonian in a loose sense. It predates Newton and goes beyond him, but where the Newtonian mechanics is sort of this like linchpin that these conceptions change. So we'll talk about this one next week. We're not really going to get to this one at all today. We're mainly going to talk about this one. We'll do a little bit with this one as we sort of go. But okay, so these are features that no longer exist. But Taylor also says we need to do something else. Is it not enough just to describe these three things that don't exist? We also need to describe what replaces them. And the goal, figure out how this new thing, the thing that he's calling this exclusive humanism, emerges in the 1800s. Right? And it's this new possibility, this exclusive humanism, this possibility that human beings are entirely adequate to the realization of our own happiness. He's saying that that's what gives rise to this secularism 3. So we're going to need this sort of talk about how all three of these things disappear, and then what new thing is created sort of from their absence that gives rise to the modern situation. So that's sort of the framework. I'll go right back to the whiteboard, don't worry. But I just wanted to, again, just pause for a second. Again, people doing okay? Any sort of initial questions about this initial outline or roadmap of where we're going to go for the next couple of weeks? All right. Good. Remember, you can always just unmute yourself and interrupt, send something to the chat. All right, so let's begin talking enchantment, and let's actually do it. But we'll go back to the whiteboard in a little bit. But before we even get to enchantment, I actually just want to like talk about the modern situation a little bit first. This is going to be really hard for us, and what's going to make it really hard is that it's going to be impossible, as it is for everyone, to think outside of our own framework. Right? We're going to constantly keep trying to translate what Taylor's saying into a framework that it doesn't fit in, actually, that it's precisely the denial of, in a very real sense. So it might be helpful just to lay out the terrain of modernity first. So what is this disenchanted universe first? And then we'll sort of try to negatively like get back to what the alternative was. What was the other way of seeing things? It's also really important to note before we go too far with this, Taylor is not claiming that like this disenchanted universe is a philosophical theory. It's prior to that. He's saying this is a rough way that like sort of just everyone sees the world, and then various philosophical theories get sort of devised to explain. So some parts of what we're going to talk about will sound a little bit like Descartes, for example. But his claim isn't that like he's not describing Descartes. Descartes is trying to explain this disenchantment, right? Or Descartes is sort of presupposing the disenchantment and then explaining it via theory of mind-body separation, say, or mind-body dualism. Or various sort of materialist or psychological accounts of human cognition presuppose this disenchanted universe and then explain various features of the world on the basis of their specific sciences. So everything that we're going to be talking about today, more or less, is going to be on the sort of like just level of popular generalized understanding, not so much on the level of like complicated philosophical theories. Now that won't be true next week. Once we get to this conception of the universe, cosmos, time, eternity, all that stuff, then we're in the realm of some hardcore philosophy stuff. And we're gonna read some Plato, we're gonna read some Augustine, we're gonna read some ancient Egyptian thought, actually. Like we're gonna read some stuff to try to get these different conceptions. But this stuff that he's talking about today, this is all supposed to be on sort of like a mainline basic, like how does the world feel to us level? Okay. So how does the world feel to us on this level? Thoughts, feelings, the meaning you attribute to events, you all think that those are features of your mind. And what do you mean by your mind? Doesn't matter. You can mean whatever you want by it. You can mean your brain. You could mean Descartes' separate substance. You could mean whatever. It doesn't matter. We don't actually really care what we mean really by mind. But you all think that there's a whole bunch of meaning stuff going on up here. And when you see something, so let's say my little Jawa, my Star Wars Jawa bobblehead, like, oh, I love my little Star Wars Jawa bobblehead. That's not a feature of the Jawa bobblehead. That's a feature of me, right? If this thing brings me joy, that's about me, right? This thing in and of itself is neither joyful nor not joyful. It's just, what is it? It's less indifferent matter, right? It's just stuff, right? I feel it as being meaningful, perhaps. Maybe it has some personal significance. Maybe I remember when I got it as a gift in high school, and it was I was having a really bad day. But all that's about me. The meaning and significance that this thing has is a feature of me, right? And I am, in a sense, free to change that meaning to some extent, right? Like, you know, if maybe I start having bad experiences with the Jawa bobblehead, I might see it differently. Right? There's nothing fixed about it. The meaning it has comes from me. And things like me. So what is the range of things like me in that regard? It's pretty small. It's you all, right? Other human beings also have that same feature, right? So it's not just what's going on in my head, it's what's going on in all of your heads. You all are doing things similar to me. Maybe if I have a really, sophisticated understanding, maybe I think dolphins do something similar. Maybe I think elephants do something similar. Maybe I think some of the higher primates can do something similar, but most animals we don't really think do that either, right? And indeed, that's precisely how we differentiate ourselves from most other animals, is that we sort of like things mean things to us. To animals, we just see them as sort of like reacting to stimuli in various sorts of ways. And maybe also there are aliens. Maybe we can see that maybe there are other aliens, so things we haven't encountered, that also have a similar kind of power, right? And perhaps we also maybe say that there are gods or angels, right? That again would similarly be minds of some sort, and so therefore stand in a similar kind of relationship to the world, at least an analogical one. But familiar so far? Nothing sounding too strange yet? And if I was to go up and say, hey guys, this Jawa bobblehead, I'm not just talking about me. This Jawa bobblehead like spreads joy everywhere it goes. You would think I was either talking metaphorically, right? Or you would think I was being something like superstitious, right? Indeed, there's actually a fallacy we have for it. We call it the anthropomorphic fallacy of projecting our sort of like emotional commitments onto the world that's inspiring those commitments from us, right? So if you see like a blood red sky and you say, oh, it's an angry sky, we actually call that a logical fallacy. That's the anthropomorphic fallacy. The sky is not angry. Maybe the sky is making me uneasy, and so I'm interpreting it as angry, right? But that meaning that I'm attributing to it, that's sort of a mistake, right? I shouldn't really be attributing it to it. And again, I would be being superstitious otherwise. And superstition still does exist, right? But we also just recognize it as superstition. And as Taylor puts it, it sounds weird to us. Like we all know people, even maybe we ourselves sometimes fall into that trap, but it sounds weird. It's something that's sort of like askew from the times. It doesn't seem like a really rigorous or serious way of talking about the world. Still good? Everything good? Still good? Okay. And we can go one little bit farther with this. We do this with sort of as a kind of psychologism, right? Like a lot of things that we know people believed in the past, we now interpret as sort of like a psychological reaction to various emotions, right? So ghosts, right? Maybe you believe ghosts are real, maybe you don't, but you at the very least, a lot of the time, you think of ghosts more as a metaphor for people's guilt. than as like, "Boo, spirit, knock over the cup," right? Like, even if you also think maybe there are spirits who go boo and knock over the cup, you also recognize that there's a way in which like people talking about ghosts or seeing ghosts, right? They're often sort of like externalizing their own feelings of maybe guilt or shame or sadness at the passing of a loved one, right? And so sort of like psychologically projecting into the world. Similarly, again, maybe you think people can indeed suffer demonic possession, but most of the time when you see people who maybe like look as if they were possessed, or maybe in past eras you would have called them possessed, you say, no, they're suffering from some kind of mental disorder, right? There's something, wrong either with the structure of their brain, again, because you're not worried about rigorous distinctions here. Maybe there's something wrong with their brain, maybe there's something wrong with their mind, whatever, there's some mistake here, and we can just correct the mistake and they'll be fine. They'll go back to normal. Similarly, if there's a particular location maybe that brings you peace, maybe it's a church, maybe it's somewhere in nature, you don't think that those spaces are literally doing anything to you, right? You think there's just some feature of them that's inspiring feelings of contentment within you, right? It's not as if the space itself is a content space, or use a word, sacred space, right? It's rather a space that, for whatever reason about your psychology, inspires some kind of contentment or calmness within you. And maybe also within others too. Fine, we all have similar psychologies, right? But it's not a feature of, say, the quiet grove with the waterfall and the beautiful butterflies flittering or whatever that like makes you finally calm down from the stress of life. It's not a feature of that thing, really. It's how you're reacting to the features of those places. And if you had a different psychology, that same place could maybe inspire something really different, right? Maybe it could make you stressed. Maybe if your parents had been killed in a grave that looked just like that or something, right? Like then you'd have a really different reaction to that stimuli, right? So it's a feature of you at root that things have. Let's use this word meaning. Things are only meaningful insofar as they're related to some sort of mind. And meanings are things that are in features of minds, not features of the world. Even if the world in various sorts of ways inspires or causes us to formulate meanings, they're ultimately features of our minds, not of the world that inspires or generates them. Again, we good? This all, again, seem familiar? It's super weird even describing this, right? Because it's so basic that you wouldn't really think, like, you would never call this a theory. Anything that I've said, right? Like it's so basic that it's almost like hard to put your finger on. All right, let's try to enchant the universe now, and let's negate everything we just said. Let's try to figure out what it could mean to think the opposite of all of those things. And this is what Taylor is calling the enchanted universe, right? The way the universe would have seemed to people in 1500. And again, not just people high up, people down low too. Right? This isn't a theory. So let's start work on it. Anyone still need anything on the whiteboard? All right, then let's at least move stuff up anyway. Let's start unpacking how people would have thought of themselves and their world. So the central claim is that meaning is not a feature of your mind, it's a feature of reality. And when I say not minds, certainly meanings are in minds, so I should say really not exclusively within minds. That's actually the better way of putting this. Your mind is maybe part of reality, so fine, it's included, right? But the meaning isn't restricted to that one piece of reality. These meanings are everywhere. Okay, so what can that possibly mean? Let's start easy. Let's start with stuff that we can pretty readily wrap our minds around. Maybe we believe in spirits. Right? And so what do I mean by spirits? Well, I mean some things last time that we were talking about as transcendent beings, but also some things that we can understand as natural beings too. So here are some examples of transcendent spirits. Things like God, angels, Satan, other devils, right? Things that are not of nature, but also We could say natural ones, natural spirits. Things like fairies, dragons, goblins. Right? You know, fill in the blank. Keep going as far as you like, right? Yeah, the Leviathan that's at the edge of the universe. That's at the edge of the ocean, right? These things are sort of spiritual entities. They're entities with minds, right? That don't fit into the normal list that people would give. Maybe today people would still throw in God, angels, maybe Satan, though actually Satan, I think you'd probably find way more people who would say God really is a thing than who would say Satan is really a thing. But you find some who would still say Satan. But these natural spirits you just wouldn't include at all. Right? You're not going to get these natural things to be counted. These are helpful starting points because these things are still minds. Just kinds of minds that we wouldn't normally accept. All right. So one thing that's going on in this enchanted universe, we're expanding the scope of things that we have minds, or expanding the scope of what minds exist in our universe. That's at least familiar though, right? So like if I was to talk about demonic possession, we can wrap our minds around that. What does it mean? It means some sort of like evil demon thing that maybe we don't believe exists anymore, but whatever, right? Does something evil in the same way that, or analogous way to the way that human beings do evil things to one another too. So fine, meanings exist in these things. Right? There's also one that we need to add that it's going to be ambiguous. They're probably natural spirits still. We need to add the saints to this. However, and the saints are where things are going to start to get a little weird because the saints are all dead. It's very important to note. Right? So they're not like fairy, say, which is nominally alive to some extent, right? A saint is a dead holy man or woman, right? These things exist too. These things one of the things that would, I think, stun all of us with our modern experiences of religion is the extent to which most of what we would think of as religious practice in the Middle Ages was dedicated to saints. Right? Say Saint Patrick, right? So we still, who doesn't just the day where you drink beer. Right, Saint Patrick was the patron saint of healing, amongst his other functions. He did other things too. But so you might say, if you were sick, you might pray to Saint Patrick to heal you. Now, Saint Patrick is dead. It's important to note, right? And you're not praying to Saint Patrick's ghost. You're not praying to some angel, but you are praying to St. Patrick's. Okay, he's dead, but not dead, surely, right? He's in heaven. He's lived on through Christ, yada, yada, yada. So fine, right? But it is important to note that you are praying to a dead guy, and everyone would recognize a dead guy, who were still imagining exerting some kind of causal power in the world despite being dead. Right? But let's make it weirder. Most of the time, you're not even going to pray directly to St. Patrick. Most of the time, you're going to hold a piece of bone that you believe was a bone of St. Patrick, a relic. That is actually mostly what you are going to have or want to have or go touch. So if you're sick, you will go to maybe Dublin and find where in the church there are relics from St. Patrick, and you'll touch them to be healed. Right. So now we're not even praying to a dead guy. Now we're praying to bones that maybe belonged to a dead guy at some point in the past. Or a cloak, a piece of a cloak that belonged to this dead guy in the past. Right? Or maybe not even that. Maybe you're going to go to where St. Patrick worked his miracles. You're going to go to that physical location in the world, that sacred space, because in that space you can be healed. And you'll pray to St. Patrick and Jesus and hold the relic in the sacred place, and healing will happen. Why? Because the meaning of St. Patrick is not a feature of him, his mind. It is a feature of the world that has spread into the world through his actions. It is now the meaning of his life, that healing, if that's what one of the meanings for him, that meaning is a feature not only of him and his mind and how we think about him, it is also a feature of the objects that he touched. It is a feature of the places that he inhabited. Sacred spaces, sacred objects. These are meaningful in themselves. Think of it as a meaning power. Right? A power to impart their meaning onto other things. Right? And so maybe the grove where St. Patrick worked a miracle to heal someone, because of the overwhelming power of that act, that is now a sacred space, a space that has that meaning within it, that meaning of healing within it. And it can, in turn, impart that meaning onto other things, namely me if I'm sick. Right. How are we doing? This is where things are going to get weird, right? Like, we keep wanting, our natural tendency is going to be to want to psychologize all of this. Right? Or to make it features of maybe, no, God's the one doing it. No, the sacred space is the one doing it. Now, it's doing it with God's blessing, certainly, right? But it's the sacred space that's doing it. And why do I insist upon that so strongly? Because there are evil places and evil objects too, that also work their mischief then, not just the sacred ones. That can curse me. That can literally cause me to become sick because I'm in a fairy's grove. And the fairy magic will harm me. Or will evil love potion will make me commit adultery and ruin my soul.
So
and again,
I've got a quick question.
Yeah, go ahead, please.
So I just want to make sure that in the Enchanted Universe, we're still looking at this from outside of the human mind. Like, this is a part of reality that we should assume is true.
That is right. That's exactly right. The love potion, it's not evil because we interpret it as bringing about evil consequences for human beings. It is evil.
Okay, cool. Just making sure.
This thing spreads joy. Right? It's not my mind taking joy in it. That's exactly right. Yeah, exactly as you were saying it. That's exactly right. It is features of the objects, the places, the beings in the world that they are evil, malicious, harmful, hurtful. Now, let's contrast this though, because again, this is so easy for us. We think things can make us sick too, right? We think maybe bacteria makes us sick. But if we're being precise, that's actually not strictly speaking accurate. What does bacteria do? It just does whatever it does, right? Bacteria obeys its sort of physical laws, and those physical laws interact with my body in various kinds of ways and will cause various kinds of effects. And I might decide that those effects are bad. And so say, hey, this COVID-19 virus made me sick. But the COVID-19 virus didn't make me sick, right? The COVID-19 virus is just doing what it does. It's just unfolding its own natural processes, right? It's causal. Maybe it causes me to get sick, but not in any sort of agentive way and not in any kind of meaning way, right? All it's doing is just enacting its own physical principles in the world. The sense of maliciousness here is far more explicit than that, right? Like the evil place, it's like actively harming me. That's what it's doing. the best we can do with this is as if it had a mind, but people didn't think it had a mind, right? It's as if we're treating it like a mind thing, but it was not thought in that way. It was just thought of as having this power. So think of it like it's almost like a completely different understanding of causality is implied here. We think of causality as one thing bumping into another thing and that doing something. They're thinking of causality as meaning, not objects, exerting meaning causes on other things, right? The love charm exerts its meaning on me. It doesn't enact chemical changes in my body. It makes love happen in me, right? The relic doesn't cure my body of the bacterial infection that was causing inflammation. It spreads healing to me. We're talking about magic. Quite literally, we're talking about magic. Right? But not magic, again, this is sort of, again, where it's so weird. Not magic in like the Game of Thrones sense or the Dungeons and Dragons sense, where what is in our portrayals of magic are just like really advanced sciences, right? Where there's like these like necessary rules that you follow and you like say the incantation and the thing happens, right? When you read stories of old magic, it's way weirder than the magic that we think of. It's not just a form of technology. It is meaning and significance bleeding into the world. Or from our perspective, bleeding in the world. It was already in the world from their perspective. So in that Curse of the Werewolf movie, try to give you an example to make this really vivid. So one of the things that happens in this movie is that there's this mute servant woman. And this is basically the beginning of the movie, so I'm not really spoiling anything. But there's this mute servant woman who sort of befriends this beggar who's been locked up in a dungeon and gone mad because of him being locked in the dungeon. And so they become sort of friends. But one day things go wrong. The lord of the manor tries to rape her, and she refuses. And so she gets thrown into the dungeon with the guy. The guy's gone completely mad and indeed does rape her. Right, and as a result of this union, it produces a son. The son, the whole premise of the movie, the son is quite literally cursed by the meaning significance surrounding his birth. Right, all of the negativity, the evil, the harm that was around the birth, that is now in the son. That significance passes down. Moves down, moves in. That's not the same kind of causality we're normally talking about. Right? That's not Newtonian forces bumping into each other or whatever, right? We're not saying the kid has a birth defect. I mean, even though he becomes a werewolf, right? It's a spoiler alert, right? He becomes a werewolf, right? We're not saying that like there's something wrong with his genes. We're saying that the meaning conditions around his birth bleed into the birth. Bleed into him in a way that he cannot resist. And so the central tension of the movie is whether or not he becomes a werewolf. That's the form that all this takes, right? But the central tension of the movie is like, is he going to find some other meaning source, in this case, love, that will be able to resist all the other negative meanings that are sort of part of his, we would almost want to say his DNA or something, right? But they're not thinking of it as DNA. They're thinking of it just as like him. Is these sort of meanings and the sort of the bleeding of these meanings into him. How are we doing? Is this making sense? I know this is so hard and so weird to try to think through. Is this like working? Are you getting a sense of it? People have questions, comments, thoughts people want to do. Yeah, there's talks about when I was using the word magic, someone was bringing up in the chat that I was perhaps speaking too quickly, and that's fine. Magic can mean sort of a bunch of different things and be used in a bunch of different contexts. The sense of magic, when Taylor is using the term, he's using it to refer to like basically the transference of meaning events, meaning power from objects or people into other objects and people, rather than the D&D style magic where like I learned this spell and then cast fireballs, and it's basically equivalent to firing a gun just with a different science behind it, right? Just with different sort of like magic laws as opposed to physics laws. Right. This is the imposition of meaning. Yeah, Aiden, go ahead.
Yeah, I just had a question because on page 37, Taylor gives a description of what like classifies a religion, and I was just wondering what you thought of it. He's talking about like the idea that what he's talking about, he says, let's see. Oh, he's talking about causal action in there.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that sounded like a really Buddhist concept about how things are caused, and that's how we think of it in our mind.
Right.
But we think of that as a religion. What did you think about that? Because I kind of got confused on where Buddhism would sit in Taylor's definition there.
Yeah, Taylor, so this is a good question, and one that we're not going to be able to do full justice to until we get outside of the West. Taylor at least wants what he's saying to work with Buddhism. I'm not sure if he's right, but he at least thinks that he can sort of like render Buddhism in a way where what he's saying fits within it, obviously with some differences, but that you can see Buddhism too is positing a sort of transcendent order outside of codependent origination. So you have codependent origination, which is basically nature in the West, and then you have nirvana, which is whatever negatively we say it is. One of the negative things is it's outside the order of arising in codependent origination. So he would say that he at least wants to read it, whether he's right or not. I've got some concerns, but he at least wants to read it that we could read similar things happening within certain Buddhist cultures to what he's describing as happening within Western cultures here. Does that help?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that just cleared up. I didn't want to be confused going forward.
Yeah, absolutely.
Reading it about like what that would be. So thank you.
I don't think he thinks what he's saying about Hinduism would I don't think Hinduism fits his story. I think he well knows that. Chinese stuff I don't think fits his story, and ancient stuff he also knows doesn't fit his story either. But he at least is hoping Buddhism does. He at least thinks he can sort of say Buddhism is doing something similar enough. We're going to complicate that story as we go throughout the semester, but that's at least his initial claim. Awesome, good. Any others? Any other questions or thoughts at this point? So see, someone's asking something in the chat. Let me just read through it. Yeah, I think that's basically, so we're talking about the idea of sort of like curses and generational curses, right? Sort of like blood pollution as a thing that gets passed down. Is that a similar kind of idea? And I think it is. I think the idea of a kind of like a blood pollution or that kind of like generational curse would sort of like fit within this. At least as a kind of analog, another sort of way of thinking about it. Because again, like I'm not sure if this is exactly what you were thinking of in your question, but your question made me think of some of the ancient Greek myths. And like in those contexts, yeah, like a similar kind of thing, right? Like, Agamemnon's father actually does some evil thing, and then that evil deed sort of like passes down to his children, and they're forced to like pay for the consequences of it. It probably doesn't work, interestingly, with the idea of original sin in a Christian context. Original sin in a Christian context is actually something pretty different that we'll talk more about later on. It's actually, weirdly, original sin is in the history of Christianity, it's comparatively new. It doesn't really emerge until probably 500 to 600 years within Christianity. St. Augustine's the first person who really talks that way. And a bunch of other Christian traditions aren't going to want to talk that way at all. But even St. Augustine doesn't mean something like blood pollution. That's not what he means by it. So interestingly, that one might not quite fit with this sort of enchanted talk. But yeah, any kind of like blood pollution and that kind of tradition of thinking probably fits within it, at least analogically. Good. Any others? All right, then let's keep moving. Let's get to maybe what conception of self are we getting if we're thinking of the world in this way, right? Because we're part of this world. And what Taylor suggests is that we end up with this conception of ourselves as what he suggests is porous. And he contrasts this with what he's going to talk. We'll talk more about what he's saying in the modern a little bit later. But he contrasts this with what he calls in modern terms a kind of buffered self. So what do we mean by porous? We mean quite literally open. I am open and vulnerable to my environment in a way that would not seem normal to us. Like in a way, we too think we're open to our environment, but we think we're open to our environment in physical terms, like our environment can physically impact us. Here we're talking about we're open to our environment in terms of the meaning of the environment bleeding into us and our meanings. And the most obvious, or maybe the easiest way to see this, or case of seeing this, is demonic possession. Right? Moderns have actually a really hard time sensing just how scared people were of demonic possession, because we sort of think like, okay, so maybe watch The Exorcist or something, right? We still think Linda Blair, the girl in The Exorcist, we still think she's innocent, right? Like maybe her body is being damaged or something by the demon, but she's innocent. She's just a victim of the demon, sort of like moving with her joints or moving with her limbs or whatever. That's not how people were thinking of demonic possession in the 1500s. In the 1500s, demonic possession is a threat to my very mortal soul. Because what is demonic possession? It is the meaning of the demon seeping into me and becoming my demon, making my faith in God decrease, making my confidence that Christ will save me, diminishing it, my body being destroyed, but not as something separate from my moral failing as well. Right? The demon is making me worse, making me want things, making me desire things, changing me to match it. This is a moral danger, not just a physical one, right? When we watch Exorcist movies, we mainly see it as a sort of almost just kind of physical danger, right? Like this poor person, it's almost like as if it was just a disease, right? Like another weirder kind of disease we think of it, right? Like this poor person, they still remain a poor innocent person. They're just subject to this horrible demon that's making them say things, right? Here it's making me it, making me into its own image in some sense, right? Changing me. Angelina, go ahead.
Yeah, it kind of reminded me of this idea of, like, Carl Jung's idea of shadow. And I know there's like some literature that was starting to be written about it, like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. And I was wondering, do you know, like, if it's connected in any way, if it started to like culture be more explored psychologically, and when?
Yeah, I mean, so if you want to take the modern approach to it, at least, right? Like what things like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, or like what Jung's doing with the shadow self and all that, like those are sort of like what was really going on with those people who thought they were demonically possessed in the Middle Ages is this psychological thing, right? That like what's really was going on with them was that maybe they were like faced with this like sense of their own sinfulness in their own mind, and so they sort of like invent this external demon so they can sort of like externalize it upon, which is very much what Dr. Jekyll does. If you read the original story, he's very much sort of like, he's aware of this evil within himself, and so he decides he's gonna like externalize it, like put it upon the other, cleanse himself of it, and then just like create some sort of like external tormentor to do it.
Okay.
Just note, all of that is psychologizing or disenchanting what they thought was going on. Because they thought what was going on is, no, there's an external tormentor, right? Like, there is an external tormentor, and not just necessarily even like the demon, but maybe it's the place that I live, right? Or it's this love potion that I drank, right? Or this sort of like evil relic, or maybe I've abused a relic, and so I'm being punished by God for having abused it. Like the world is seeping this meaning. They saw it genuinely as it's the seeping of something external, or at least external to some extent, into themselves.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. And so what you end up with, if that's right, is just like a way scarier universe than the universe we live in, right? Like, I mean, we all think like the worst thing that can happen to us, we think, is dying. To them, that's the least of it, right? To them, like the basement goes way lower than that, right? Like, through no fault of my own, I can be destroyed, cast into hell as a sinner. And it might be too strong to say through no fault of my own, but at the very least, not entirely through the fault of my own. Right? Maybe if I was stronger in my faith, I could have resisted the malign influence of the fairy or the demon, right? Maybe, but maybe not, by the way, right? Like, also maybe not. And regardless, it's not entirely my own actions that will lead to my damnation or my salvation. And this is getting us now to why, what's the opposite of possession? Grace. Right? Grace is the opposite of salvation. This is getting us to why, from this kind of conception of self, the non-existence of God is kind of inconceivable, right? What does God do in the enchanted universe? What God does is he ensures that the good meanings are going to beat the bad meanings with time, overall. And maybe instead of even bad here, foreshadowing some of the Nietzsche, let's just say the evil. Let's actually just go evil. Let's go all out with it. The evil meanings. That the good meanings will triumph over the evil meanings. God is quite literally my salvation. People say that still, but I think people meant something a little bit stronger by it if we're getting a sense of how dangerous this enchanted universe actually is. He is that which can protect me from these malign forces. And then through God, also then his saints and his angels, right, will also work on my behalf. And the church, we'll talk about, and we're getting close to the political side of this. The church will work on my behalf through the power of God, right? But God is the guarantor. The way people in the Middle Ages thought, Taylor makes this claim in this book, and it matches some other stuff that I've seen too. I think this seems right to me. If you deny the protection of God, the other option is to be a Satanist, actually, because you still need a protector, right? The existence of these malign forces is not up for grabs. They're as apparent to you as it's apparent to us that there are no such things, right? So that's not up for grabs. It's not just that, like, well, they're a spirit, so therefore it's easier to believe in God. It's, I need to find a spirit that I can sort of like tie my boat to, right? The spirit that can help me navigate this world of meaning. If not God, then Satan, right? Because those are the games in town, or maybe a fair, or maybe try to like get in good with a fairy or something, right? Like, I mean, what are my choices, right? That's just God is the strong one. God is, that's the whole point of the Christian, the omnipotence, right? Like God's the one that's gonna win. So if I tie my boat to God, and if my society ties its boat to God, it can sort of literally ride in God as a life raft to navigate all of these other malign influences, all of the danger that I'm in, right? And danger is sort of like an interesting term in this context, right? Like, let's go back to this poor self for a second, right? There's a double sense of vulnerability here. I'm vulnerable both in the sense of dangerous things can threaten me. So I'm vulnerable in that sense. So maybe you could say a bad sense, but I'm also vulnerable in the sense of being healed. Or the way Taylor puts it, in the sense of healable. Right? In the sense that good things can come in and help me. So sort of like a double sense of vulnerability, right? We think of vulnerability now as a purely negative concept, but it has its positive upshot, right? I mean, and it does even in modernity, right? Like the fact that someone can stick a needle in you is why you can get like cured of diseases. It also means you can get stabbed in the heart, right? But they go to get, like, you also couldn't get your vaccine if you were not stabbable, if that was not the kind of thing that you are. Same thing here, this double sense of vulnerability, this sort of, we'll put it this way, spiritual kind of vulnerability that we have, right? It both is threat, but it's also the possibility of salvation. So why would I give up God then, right? Like the only reason to do it would be if I thought I had a better source of salvation going around. If I thought I had a better protector, again, that's why the only other option is really Satanism, right? And there is some evidence that some people did that actually, as Taylor points that out, and there's other sources that say the same thing, right? There's not really much evidence for there being atheists, at least now, again, in Western Europe during this time frame. Other time periods, different things, but in Western Europe during this time frame, we don't have much evidence of there being atheists. but we do have some evidence of there being Satanists. Right? People who thought Satan was a better bet for where to go to get help navigating through life. How are we doing? Is this stuff working? Is it making sense? Is the Taylor making more sense? I'm hoping a little bit too, maybe that it's also a little bit clearer what he's saying. Because it's so different. It's such a weird way of thinking. Yeah, Miguel, go ahead.
Question. I wanted to ask the example that you brought up about like the needle and like severing the heart. Can you explain that specific point again so I can write it down or remember it?
Oh yeah,
you mentioned him. Yeah.
Yeah. So this was just like, so this is just like our version of this double sense of vulnerability, right? So like I might think like, oh, it'd be great to be invulnerable, right? It'd be great if my skin couldn't be penetrated, right? If it wasn't porous, to use his language, right? It wasn't a porous thing. And indeed, there is danger with it being porous, because it's porous, I can get stabbed and die. But also because it's porous, I can get a vaccine.
Yeah.
Right?
Okay,
or I can get surgery done on me. Right? And it's the same feature, this sort of analogy, it's the same feature of me that lets both the bad things and the good things happen. This kind of spiritual porousness. It's both dangerous, but also it opens up this sort of healing power too to come in, and allows it to come in too to protect me. Right? The guardian angel sense of it. Does that help?
That really helps. Thank you.
Awesome. Great. Brittany, go ahead.
This is perhaps a little random, but I thought this would be a good question for you, given your kind of some of your areas of speciality. Page 35, Taylor says, why does Mercury cure venereal disease?
Oh, yeah.
This is contracted in the market, and Hermes is the god of markets. So I follow the Hermes thing. I don't follow the whole we contract venereal disease in the market thing. That was that I did not understand, and I kind of annotated that I wasn't entirely sure about that.
No, actually, that's actually a good one. So let's go through that example. Because that is one where you need sort of my specialty, actually, because actually he's actually going there now to a sophisticated philosophical theory. So during this time period, it's actually an account of causality, interestingly enough. One of the main theories of causality going at this time was what was called the theory of sympathetic causation. So that basically like things caused like in other things, right? So let's use that example to sort of help with it, right? So this was from certain medical journals. We're basically saying this, that Mercury was the cure for venereal diseases. And so why? Well, Mercury is the god of the marketplace, right? And so, why do we care about Mercury? We're talking about the metal, right? Well, yeah, but the metal is like Mercury the god, right? That the meaning of that Mercury the god dude, right? Because Mercury the metal is like him, there is this kind of sympathetic causal relationship such that it has the powers of Mercury the god. Similarly, where do we get venereal diseases from? We get them from prostitutes. And where do we find prostitutes? In the marketplace. So maybe that was the missing piece of it, perhaps. Yeah. So that's where we get venereal disease. So Mercury is the god of the marketplaces. So Mercury, the metal, has the power of the god Mercury, and that power must work in the place where Mercury works, the marketplace. And the same causal powers are at play in all of them. Is that the?
Yeah, the connection that I, in particular, because I understand, the mythology and the reference and the Mercury and the association there, but yeah, I guess I just wasn't as familiar with, well, where do you go to procure yourself a prostitute?
That's right, yes.
Okay,
you go to the marketplace.
That makes a lot of sense. All right, thank you.
Yeah, and interestingly, that's not a common person theory. There we enter the realm of like only intellectuals accepted this theory of sympathetic causation. It's really complicated. It's actually my account of it was way oversimplified. It's super weird. It goes back to late Neoplatonic philosophy. Super weird stuff. And like the average person wouldn't have thought any of that, right? But notice how like everyone was working from this conception of self and this conception of the world, of causal powers, and so it suggests certain kinds of theories then on its basis. Whereas when we all hear this theory of sympathetic causation, it seems stupid to us, but it's because we have the kind of causes we're interested in is one thing hitting another thing and moving, and boom, boom. right? And that's just a different kind of cause. You're going to get very different kind of theories of causation if that's your paradigmatic case. And that's what Newton does. Newton makes that the paradigmatic case that then gets used to understand all other kinds of causal relationships as one thing bumping into another thing. Good. Any others? Yeah, these are great questions. Yeah, these are all really good questions. And I'm hoping this is helping too. I'm hoping it's like giving us sort of a window back, and almost I'm hoping like you're getting a vague sense of just like, wow, that would be really scary. That would be like a really scary universe to think you lived in. All right, good. Let's do a few other things. So there's a couple things I want to note about this. This enchanted universe that Taylor is talking about, this is a relatively narrow range in European history where this is where people would have thought of themselves as living. The precise date, it's hard to know, but certainly if you go back, maybe let's go back 1,000 years, Plato would not have thought like this at all. None of this would have made sense to Plato. This would have also, and that's it. We're going back to like 2,000 years at that point, but whatever. Go back even, none of this would have made sense to Plato or Aristotle or the ancient Greeks. Some pieces of it would have. Pieces of it would have, but pieces of it would not have made sense to them in terms of how they were thinking about things. Particularly a lot of the moral stuff actually wouldn't be gone. The sort of moral danger would be gone from their conception. Right, so we're talking about what's going on in a very specific time and place within Europe. This is not, go back, and Taylor brings it out. This is part of the reason why he thinks when this goes away, something new is going to have to replace it, because this isn't what's going on with ancient Greek philosophy. So something's going to have to replace ancient Greek ways of conceptualizing the world too, because it would have been really different. They wouldn't have broken the world up like this. Elements of it would have been similar, elements of it would have been different. So that's one thing it's important to note. But the other thing it's important to note is that this isn't just an individualized matter. This is a social matter and political matter too. So this will be where we'll end today. Let's talk a little bit just about that second of those two things that Taylor wants to explain how it changed. So let's now go to the social ramifications of the enchanted universe. Again, something that would be really hard for us to get our minds around, just because of how different it is from the modern way that Christian churches operate. The main thing that the Christian church was doing during this time was serving as a source of white magic for the average person, for the average lay person on the street. It's a source of like the good meaning power. That's its primary function for the average layperson on the street. Right now, obviously, different for the monks, different for the bishops, perhaps different maybe for some of the intellectuals. But for the average layperson on the street, this is the main thing they're getting from church. I joked earlier, but it's quite true. People went to church maybe once or twice a year during the Middle Ages, maybe. And by go to church, I mean like go to a sermon or something, right? They wasn't often. There was a push to get people to go to confession at least once a year. The laity revolted at the idea of having to go to confession once a year. That was far too much for them, right? What the church did was basically took part in certain kind of civic rituals that were protection rituals that protected the community from malign forces. And the entire community took part in these rituals. This is not like what was going on maybe in some of other parts of medieval church life, where like the bishops would be preaching in Latin and everyone would be sitting there, and you know, everyone's involved. Everyone's involved in these rituals. Say when you before the harvest, maybe the bishop comes, takes all the relics, you march around the fields, and like, what is the point of this? It is to keep demons out of the corn so that the corn will nourish you rather than making you sick. Right? And again, sick in that double sense of destroying your body, but also destroying your soul. Right? And these were what people did. So the entire community speaks of God then, right? It's all oriented around God. I love Taylor's metaphors. He comes up with some just great metaphors. Like being part of the medieval world and not believing in God would be like being super into light bulbs but not believing there was electricity. Because God's the thing that makes this whole communal life work. It's his power that's, you want to put it this way, is powering the civic rituals. That's making the magic efficacious, right? And so to deny God is to do all these rituals but not think they're going to do anything, which you wouldn't do, right? These rituals are more fundamental than any doubt you might have about life. You've been doing these rituals your entire life. They are literally how the community comes together and holds together. Right? They are what we come together to do. Right? Also, heresy is not some idle private matter, if this is correct. It endangers the entire community. By endangering the efficacy of the white magic. By endangering the efficacy of the rituals. Right? It really is odd to all of us, having grown up in a Protestant world, even if you're not Protestant, to get why people cared about what other people believed so much. We just want to be like, well, it's a private thing. Who cares? Who cares if people didn't believe in God? Well, you care if they're not believing in God means your protection ritual is not going to work, right? The danger is real. There is real danger here to the entire community, to your individual private spiritual life, right? And so other things are going on when the Inquisition is also serving kinds of political functions, yada, yada, yada. But like the sense of the danger in people is super real. And you're not going to think religion is just a private thing if that danger to you is real. If how your neighbor practices affects you and how your life is going to go and the efficacy of your practice. Right? Not just by being a witch or something. I mean, witchcraft may be an example of this, but just literally like, if your neighbor believes some heresy and is making God angry, guess what? The corn will kill us. Or the corn will die, and we'll all die for that reason. Right? Or demons will get in. And we hear this, and this all just seems like superstition to us. Fine, let it seem like superstition. It didn't seem like superstition to them. And our conception of what's believable and what's not believable, we can't impose that super sense that this is all just superstition back upon them. Right? To them, this was a real pressing danger. And religion can't be a private matter if this is true. So how are we doing? Is this okay? Is this making a past that maybe always seemed really strange make a little bit more sense, perhaps? All right, I think I'm probably good with stopping here. I think we got through just about everything I wanted to talk about today. We didn't really talk as much about what the modern alternative or what changes, which Taylor began talking a little about, but we'll get plenty of time for that as we sort of go. We'll get to this buffered self. Maybe as early as next Thursday, but if not the following week, we'll start getting at what this buffered self is in alternative. Yeah, people good? Any last questions, thoughts, anything people want to ask about or bring up? All right, I think this will be a great place for us to stop for the day then. Thank you all very much. I hope this was good. Hope this was helpful. Made Taylor make a little bit more sense at least. And what we'll turn to next time, we're going to get to some of the more intellectual theory stuff that's at play. We're going to focus on especially time, what sort of medieval conceptions of time were, time and eternity, but also we'll do a little bit with the difference between a cosmos and a universe, and also the account of nature as well. So we'll do a little bit with all three of those things. They're going to be pretty closely related, actually, so we'll be able to do all three of them more or less at the same time, focusing especially on eternity. Next time, I have about maybe 5 to 6 pages of Taylor for you to read, where he talks about this. But more, I actually am going to give you a couple of excerpts from some ancient philosophical sources that I'd like you to try to read. So there's something from Plato's Timaeus. Just do your best. Plato's Timaeus is nightmarishly hard. Do your best with it. Don't worry if it's not making a lot of sense. We'll go over it in class. I'm giving you something from St. Augustine that will still be hard, but probably a little bit more readable. And then something that should actually be pretty readable, which is an account of ancient Egyptian philosophy, and ancient Egyptian, particular cosmology. The account of what's called the first occasion. And this corresponds to the third sense of eternity that Taylor is going to point to, that he thinks is not just specific to the West, that this is one that's present all over the world, and he's quite right. So I figured we'd look at this Egyptian source of it, because it's one of the earliest examples of this kind of eternity that we see. So get all that read. It shouldn't be much more reading than normal, just a couple different sources. And that's where we'll pick up on Tuesday. Thank you all very much. Have a good weekend.
Thank you, you too.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Have a good one.